Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, and today we're going to be checking out the latest by Johnny Harris. This video is called World War II in the Pacific, Why Japan Lost. So I'm interested to see if he has maybe a less popular take or maybe another perspective to look at. The narrative has largely been lack of production in comparison to, say, the United States, an overextension of their empire, and a philosophy near fascism that is often seen as self-defeating. So this original video for you to check out is listed down below, and let's take a look at this. All right, so is this just going to be like a explainer video again, or is there going to be some kind of take? Because, of course, this kind of stuff gets covered all the time, you know, World War history and how it ends, how it begins. But I don't know. We'll see what Johnny's got.
This region, the Pacific, recently it's heating up. And now is probably a good time to rewind and remember what this region looked like back when there was a war happening out here on these islands.
All right.
A war between great powers.
Let's see where he starts with Japanese Empire.
Let's start right here, at the end of the 1800s, when Japan is expanding fast.
Okay. Now, why is this happening at this time? Meiji Restoration. Meiji Restoration was in the decades leading up into this, where Japan basically restructured its whole system. Changed its foreign policy, changed its economy, changed its outlook in a lot of ways. And what that did is brought in rapid industrialization to Japan. One thing we found in the age of industrialization that coincided with it was an age of imperialism. Imperialism fueled industrialization for countries that practice it. A lot of that is because there are things required for industrialization, such as natural resources and land, to fuel that industrialization. And Japan was doing something very similar to the other Europeans and industrial nations were doing at that same time. So you see them branching out for, again, resources, control of people, places, markets, all of those sorts of things here. So that's going, you know, even up to this part where they're saying the Japanese empire is expanding, because that's why they're expanding.
Conquering territory, taking the resources, becoming a powerful empire. By 1940, their empire looks like this. It includes hundreds of remote islands out here in the Pacific, and Japan uses these colonies to extract resources that fed this growing conquest.
Right.
But they don't have everything they need yet. They still rely on the US for the most vital of resources, oil and metal. Now, the US doesn't necessarily like how aggressive Japan is being in their region, but they tolerate it.
Why? Money. Japan's a huge market to sell to. So oil producers in the United States love selling to Japan. Now, this is something, as you can tell, Japan doesn't want to have. If you're an industrial imperial nation, you don't want to necessarily rely on just like trade with these other countries when you can extract it yourself. It's why you engage in imperialism rather than just doing trade with other nations. And having something like oil, that's a huge deal because oil runs countries. And Japan also does not like the fact, you know, that they are so dependent on the Americans, but they also understand that without the Americans, they don't exist when it comes to this imperial and military expansion at this time. The other thing here is kind of going back, you saw this empire, right? So we have this Japanese empire.
US for the
That's large here. Now, what is their justification for coming into these places? How do they market themselves? Well, there was this idea of creating a greater pro-Asian like sphere of influence. Now, what Japan was saying is that this whole part of East Asia, Southeast Asia had been colonized, conquered for years, exploited, if you will. And that is all true. Of course, that's all true, right? So Japan coming in to be a protector of a larger Asian sphere, a protector of these people against, you know, Western imperialism. Now, the irony that people talk about is that Japan ends up doing the same thing, and in a lot of brutal fashion as well. So there was irony that's been attributed to Japan for the way that they do this and for what they say are the reasons to do this.
most vital of resources, oil and metal. Now, the US doesn't necessarily like how aggressive Japan is being in their region,
But money
they
trumps
tolerate it.
policy.
That is, until Japan allies itself with Nazi Germany, and then continues its expansion into a French colony and threatens to completely cut off the US from its ally China. So
Now, Japan or the United States was already against Japan at this time. They were very outspoken in their invasion in 1937 of China. In China, there was a leadership by Chiang Kai-shek that was supported by the Americans. The Americans supported the regime there and were against that. So them kind of trying to put pressure on the Japanese economically, actually kind of predates this, even before Japan became official allies with the Germans, because that's not going to happen for another about 3 years after that.
So the US, along with Britain and the Netherlands, cut Japan off of oil, gas, iron, and steel. These are
the Dutch
vital
control a lot of those
resources,
islands.
So this is a major blow to Japan. They calculate that they only have 2 more years before they run out of this vital energy. They must act quickly. So they start looking further south, to land that is known to have a lot of oil. The problem for
Indonesia,
Japan is that this is all controlled by European empires.
Right.
Japan makes a plan to kick out all of these Europeans and establish their own access to oil and metal so they aren't reliant on outsiders. And they sell this ambitious plan to their people by saying that they actually want to liberate Asia from European domination.
Good. Glad Johnny said that. I forgot the exact name they used there. Yeah, the sphere of influence over Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity sphere. So it's like these countries are going to unite against foreign imperialism while Japan engages in said imperialism. They're the defenders of the Asians,
December 1941, they initiate this plan, sending ships and planes to drop bombs all over the region that they want to conquer. And to stop the Americans from coming to the Europeans' rescue, Japan has already sent a large chunk of its navy to surprise the Americans by bombing their navy in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Okay. It was their first step for kicking off this larger offensive.
Okay, I mean, something has to be talked about here too, is negotiations potentially for an ending of the embargo. Because at this time, there's now an embargo. There's an embargo of the United States to selling oil to Japan. And interestingly, there was political negotiations going on at this time as the Pearl Harbor attack was going. The military is going to go do their own thing, which ruins the diplomatic side that the Japanese government is trying to deal with. The Japanese military, again, they operate on their own in Japan, totally separate from political entities. They run the show, and especially have done that since, say, the Great Depression, when economically things were struggling, but their military was doing fantastic and really was, push come to shove, the power. It almost reminds you of the old, like shogunate era, where, okay, you have a government, emperor, whatever, but push comes to shove, who's really in charge? The people who lead the military. So this obviously ended any kind of negotiations
all over Asia
to
were
end the
a
embargo.
Huge, bold, and risky move for Japan. No one thought they would do it. It came as a massive surprise, and as a result, it was incredibly successful for Japan's
Some people
goals.
argue how surprising
the US
it was.
and its allies are now at war, but beating back Japan will not be easy. Japan has a powerful navy, and not only is America's Pacific Fleet severely damaged because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, but around this same time, Hitler has taken the moment to declare war on the US, dragging them into the European theater of World War II.
After. Within days.
Over the next 7 months, Japan takes even more territory.
Powerful and resourceful gangsters have banded together to make war upon the whole human race. Their challenge has now been flung at the United States of America. Together with other free peoples, we are now fighting to maintain our right to live among our world neighbors in freedom, in common decency.
Those are big statements to talk about. He's saying there, you can hear President Roosevelt there saying that just the world is under attack and everyone's right to existence is ending. And those are things that really get the common person going, right? Saying that you personally are under threat. And that's what he's saying is happening here. You got Germany, and then you throw in Japan, and it's a great message and why, retaliation for this was, so high.
Without fear of assault. We are now in this war.
The US has to surrender the Philippines, its foothold in the Pacific, and Japan forces capture and kill tens of thousands of American and Filipino troops in just one of what would become many horrific war crimes they commit during this war.
Probably the worst war camp, like POW camp of anybody on any side of this war you'd want to be in is probably a Japanese one. The Japanese have harken back, their military this time harkens back to a culture of, you don't surrender, you're better off, dying. Bushidos, commit seppuku, something like that. And And also to make sure that their people don't surrender as well, they basically were taught to be especially brutal and, kill people and stuff like this in these camps, because they want, Japanese soldiers to know that if you surrender, this is what would happen to you. You'd be better off dead. But yeah, incredibly brutal. Then go over to China, see what happens over there with the brutality over there. And a lot of these places, again, where they're creating this sphere of co-prosperity. And yeah, absolutely brutal. Now, that attack on the Philippines happened within hours of Pearl Harbor too. Not a lot of people remember that it was not just an assault on Pearl Harbor. It was on other possessions going on. And again, not even just American, of course. You saw the other countries that have possessions in this place, but yeah, the Americans were under attack. Philippines was not ready for this at all. Again, something the United States had territorial control over, and yeah, had to give it up. And the Americans were losing at this time. Those attacks were again, they were very successful, and it took a long time to recoup. But I'm sure Johnny's going to get back about how the U.S. rebounded so quickly.
By the middle of 1942, Japan has achieved its goals of kicking out European empires and securing for itself a massive empire full of resources. They're now self-sufficient, and they're growing. And they're not done. They're drunk on all of this success. And some military leaders want to keep pushing east, all the way to here, which would cut the US off from its big ally, Australia. So they set their sights on this American base, located on a small atoll called Midway. If they could take Midway, the US would be so weak, Japan calculates, that they would be forced to settle this conflict, leaving Japan with all of this newly conquered territory.
Well, Midway was seen and discussed as the Americans that it's Midway because it's in the middle, essentially, of the Pacific Ocean, that it was going to be a forward operating base for a direct attack on the western coast of the United States. So California, etc. That was how it was told, to the people, and also why it was very important. Now, he's kind of saying here that an actual invasion or takeover of the United States was never in the cards. And, that's probably true, but definitely was told, though, that that's what these things would be used for. These islands.
That's not what happened. In May of 1942, territory. Alas, that's not what happened. In May of 1942, Japan sends a massive fleet of hundreds of planes, accompanied by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, as well as 4 of their precious aircraft carriers.
Those are
now. Remember,
deal.
This is World War II.
Ones they used for Pearl Harbor.
You can't really fight a war out here in the ocean without aircraft carriers.
Most important
which
part
enabled
of the Navy.
Japan's planes to land and refuel while fighting deep out in this ocean. Aircraft carriers are vital. So Japan is preparing to conquer Midway. But what they don't know is that American codebreakers in Hawaii have cracked Japan's encrypted communication and are aware of their battle plans days before the attack.
Something that would have been useful, say, before Pearl Harbor, right? There's a lot of conspiracy. There's a lot of criticism of how the United States was not prepared for Pearl Harbor. And a lot of it is very legitimate. But yeah, this stuff would have been very useful before then, huh? But yeah, aircraft carriers are everything. Interestingly, and thankfully for the United States, they actually did not have as much of their fleet as they usually can have at Pearl Harbor. There were ships, very important ones that were out of the harbor at that day. That also fuels some of the conspiracy, for that too, but whatever. Pearl Harbor could have been worse.
This makes all the difference, and in a 4-day battle, the U.S. defeats Japan's Navy at Midway, destroying all 4 of their precious aircraft carriers in the process.
The odds looked impossible, but when it was all over,
Japan can't replace these
their greatest naval defeat
very well
in history.
It's a huge blow to Japan's momentum, and from here, the U.S. and its allies start to turn the tide on this war in the Pacific. Hey, I know we're talking about World War II, but I just want to pause really quick for a message from our sponsors. We can't make journalism and history stories like this without sponsors. So thank you, BetterHelp, for sponsoring today's video. I don't know about you, but I am someone who did not realize that mental health was important until just a few years ago. I knew that exercise, physical exercise, was really important for my body, but in recent years I've learned that mental health, the coaching and processing of your thoughts with a professional, is just as important. I've been in therapy for a few years now, not because of any clinical condition, but because I simply am a human who has relationships and struggles and invasive thoughts, and with a therapist I am able to talk through those in a very safe, trusting environment. It has been a game changer for me. BetterHelp BetterHelp is a platform that allows you to access a therapist much easier than the more traditional way. You sign up for BetterHelp, you take a quiz about who you are and what you're struggling with, and then what they do is they pair you with a licensed therapist within their huge network of tens of thousands of therapists. You can be talking to a therapist really quickly, and you can do it in whatever way is most comfortable to you. Text, video call.
Anyone use BetterHelp?
What I do a phone call.
I feel like I've heard good and
not
walking
as good
through
things. The forest, which is
probably just depends on what you're looking for.
The whole point of therapy is to find someone that is not judging you, but is hearing you and guiding you through your own thoughts and your own struggles. If your therapist isn't a good fit, with BetterHelp, you can pretty quickly and easily switch to someone else, which is a big deal if you've ever looked for a therapist the traditional way. If you want to try this out, you can get a discount with the link in my description. It's betterhelp.com/JohnnyHarris. When you click the link, it helps support the channel. It also gets you in on 10% off your first month of BetterHelp. You can try it out at a discount and see if therapy will change your life as much as it has mine. Thank you, BetterHelp, for sponsoring today's video. Let's dive back into this map of World War II.
Let's do it. I'm trying to think if I've missed anything context-wise.
Both
probably.
Sides. Distance.
Help down below.
It's sort of hard to fathom the distances out here. Like, you could fit the mainland United States in just one small part of the Japanese Empire.
Okay.
And remember that the U.S. military...
Yeah, but it's like, there's barely anything out there. It's like not that significant.
To travel thousands
Plus,
of kilometers.
It's not like the Japanese can monitor every single thing out in all of these places. But
just to get here. Distance is also... The U.S. military has to travel thousands of kilometers just to get
these islands are
Distance
tiny.
Is also a problem for Japan.
A couple square miles.
Yes, just conquered all of this territory. But that means that it now has to ship resources back to the mainland. It has to get men, doctors, food, and supplies out to all of this land thousands of kilometers away, creating brand new supply routes. We found this old Japanese map drawn up during the war that shows all of these colonies shaded with a red marker and showing this dizzying web of supply lines needed to keep the war going. This was a logistical nightmare for Japan, but it was also a key vulnerability that...
Let's remember that overextension of an empire, especially ones that are created quickly, have a tendency to collapse on itself just from the logistical standards. And especially if it's created super fast. Look at the Mongols. They created something so fast and then breaks apart. Alexander the Great expands, breaks apart. Okay. The Romans, the opposite end of things, create a massive empire done very slowly, but still slowly bled because of it. The more you conquer, the more you have to take care of. That means more, again, economic resources, means more infrastructure in the Romans' case, and it would have to happen here too, is more military. All of a sudden you're spending, the Romans were spending about half of their entire income on the military at a time. And you can't run a country like that, especially if it's large, or an empire like that, and it's large, and you have the needs to take that you got to take care of, because this means increased taxes, means a lot of different things.
The U.S. would exploit in this,
especially if it's not organic growth.
So the U.S. begins cutting into the Japanese empire. It's off to a slow start, but eventually they settle onto a strategy of targeting certain...
Okay, you didn't really talk about Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is down below in the map down here, and it was basically being used as a forward operating base for attacking Australia. He hasn't really talked about that he's like saying that like to cut off Australia, or I don't know if he's insinuating that like it wasn't of interest. It was. The Japanese attacked northern Australia. It's one of the places the Americans tried to get to quickly to help protect, as it was an ally, right? It's part of the Commonwealth of the British Empire. So Guadalcanal was one of the places where actually, the troops had to get boots on the ground, where someone like Midway, it's an aerial and it's a naval battle, but like Guadalcanal, it's like boots on the ground. Again, to be able to take that base and not let it be used by the Japanese for attacks on Australia. It's also where, by the way, where the Americans learned how difficult it was to attack, to fight the Japanese boots on the ground in these territories. Because although these islands are, tiny, they're incredibly well defended. The geography is very difficult because of, you got climate, you've got the jungle and stuff like that. And the Japanese are masters of fighting that, where like the Americans, not so much.
Islands, not the ones that were the most fortified. Settle onto
island
a strategy
hopping campaign
of targeting certain islands.
Island
not
hopping.
The ones that were the most fortified, but the ones that would get them one step closer to the Japanese mainland, but also give them proximity to these supply lines. The supply lines that keep Japan's war machine running. The US starts conquering these lesser fortified islands and
Very
using
slowly.
them to target the ships that carry food and weapons and supplies throughout the Japanese Empire. I found
See,
this
that's one
data-
thing the Americans can do. They don't even have to, if they don't want to, for all these places, get boots on the ground. Again, if those aren't forward operating bases, say like a Guadalcanal is, which you probably have to get down in there, all you got to do is blockade them. They can't last that long. These islands are not self-sufficient that way, and will definitely hurt the Japanese logistical goals, which is what this is all about. I mean, yeah, it's supposed to be about protecting these islands from the other people when they're conducting the same horrible operations. And also these people, they all hated the Japanese. The Philippines, they didn't like being, basically ruled by the Americans, but being ruled by the Japanese, they felt was even worse. So the people, locals here that they are basically in charge of or protecting, whatever you want to call it, they don't like him either. And that's also, of course, a dangerous position to try to build an empire on.
Data set that shows every merchant vessel that the US and its allies sunk during these years. It's a lot.
Wow.
American submarines alone would go on to sink
Where that
5
data
million
came from.
tons of Japanese shipping and naval vessels. This strategy of targeting
Open
the
street
supply
map.
lines was a game changer for the US, allowing them to weaken the Japanese empire by targeting its cargo, like they did down here in this key Japanese military stronghold in the south of the empire. The US and its allies first conquered nearby islands, and then used these islands as a jumping off point to target the supply lines.
Like a
But instead of
chessboard
mounting an
jumping
attack
around.
on this stronghold, the US focused on the supply ships that were bringing food, ammunition,
cut 'em off.
reinforcements, and medical supplies to this stronghold.
And again, it works fantastic. And the United States does not want to put boots on the ground against the Japanese. It's brutal.
This left tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers stranded to die of starvation and disease. The US was able to take out a key Japanese base without having to fight a battle.
Also hurtful to the
Island-hopping
indigenous
strategy
people.
was really working. And if you look closely at this map, you'll see that it allowed the US to bypass these heavily fortified Japanese islands, focusing more on cutting them off than trying to conquer them,
Yep.
while also getting the US closer and closer to the mainland.
That's where some of the debates are going to be about what to do, like when mainland Japan is there. It's like once their empire is broken apart, is there any reason to keep going after Japan and to go in, right? Because they of course talked about, everyone's heard about potential land invasion, which stops with the atomic bombs and influence the decision for the atomic bombs. But yeah, it was debated that Japan could be defeated without actually having to take over Japan. All these resources are going to be gone. They're never going to be able to recover from that. And they'll never be able to retake these places again, especially if they're going to be closely watched after, which definitely would have happened.
As 1945 rolls around, the US continues to beat Japan back. The two US forces converge to retake the Philippines. All these newly captured islands allow the US to deploy their new high-tech plane, the B-29 bomber. This thing could fly super high and deep into the Japanese mainland and drop 20,000 pounds worth of bombs.
So much. So much.
Japan is clearly losing by now, so they start to resort to more brutal tactics, like having
Kamikaze.
their pilots fly their planes into US ships in suicide attacks, a deadly tactic that not only led to immense damage to the US Navy, but also
Psychologically.
had a psychological element, a realization
Glad
that
Johnny
the
said that.
enemy was willing to go to great lengths to fight back.
All lengths. There's not going to be anything to stop them. Another reason why they didn't need to go to all those islands is it would have to be a totally 100% war of attrition, which is like not worth it. They're not going to surrender. You're not going to land there and then all of a sudden surrender and then like it's over. No, you're literally going to have to fight for it. But yeah, the kamikaze thing goes in line with the growing problem the Japanese is having, which is they can't produce enough. They don't have the oil to be able to keep fueling these things, the weapons, all of the stuff, they're running out of it. So it comes to the point where these bombers, or these fighters, I should say, are going into these encounters knowing well off that they're going to die, and not just like knowing, but like expecting, and not just expecting, but actually maybe in a lot of ways I won't say looking forward to, but very much knowing that it's a massive point of pride for them to do this. And this is all, again, the psychological aware of that. You're dealing with an enemy that's expecting to die and actually glorifying the occasion, which makes this, fighting here so different than fighting in other places in World War II and other wars in general. Like you can't stop. You're not going to be able to stop them like that. They're not just going to give up, which is where policy and stuff, you're starting into uncharted waters, is how do you deal with an enemy like this? This is what brings in all the debates about the final actions that are going to happen with the United States when it comes to Japan.
But even so, Japan's empire continued to shrink, almost as quickly as it had expanded. But the closer the US gets to the mainland, the more brutal the fighting is becoming. For a variety of reasons, there's really only one path to invade the mainland.
Okinawa?
You have to hop along this southern island chain and invade from the south. So the US sets their sights on perhaps the most important island in the Pacific, Okinawa. Japan knows that the US is coming for Okinawa.
A couple of reasons, he didn't get into it about why they're important, but they are the two major things left sort of protecting Japan at this time. But they're also seen as Japanese islands. And that means even more, right? It's to these fighters. It's like, Japanese culture has such a reverence and a spiritual connection with their land that it's part of the same kind of idea. Like, you are the land is part of you. It's sacred, right? And these other places that didn't have that same significance to them. You were trying to protect the land because it's part of your culture. You're doing it for your own personal pride and ego and all that stuff. But this is like seen as defending Japanese homeland. So this is why you're going to see the fiercest. To add on to the fact that if they lose these islands, the United States basically has a very close stepping stone to an invasion potentially of the Japanese homeland.
So they recruit around 40,000 local men, giving some of them only spears to defend themselves. Together with the army, they dig tunnels and caves and trenches.
Big rocky islands.
The army gives out hand grenades to civilians, telling them to commit suicide instead of surrender, warning them that the Americans will be brutal and violent to anyone they capture. Japan wants this battle to convince the Americans that invading the mainland is a bad idea. It's their last-ditch effort to avoid defeat. The US hits the beach at Okinawa, starting one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. 82 days of violence that leaves a third of the population dead. A total of around 100,000.
By the way, I talk about this in my classes. The fighting tactics being used
violence
here.
That leaves
Let me go to
of
this. Okay, so this is a flamethrower right here. One of the things that the Americans had learned in getting boots on the ground on these islands was how every square inch of these islands was potentially defended, set up with traps, because they learned the hard way about that with so many people dying. Every square inch had to literally be cleared for safety. And that's why you're seeing like this dude with a flamethrower. There are so many things in here that could be traps, explosives, tunnels, that you had to scorch the earth inch by inch to fully have like confidence that the area is secure. You had to do this. This was not something that Americans, other people had to deal with before. Just like, you're not just using, okay, like in trench warfare, okay, you drop in and you flame throw the trenches because it's like built well for that sort of thing. But they weren't doing that to necessarily clear the things like you have here. Yeah, there are some underground bunkers and stuff, but like every square inch of foliage, like that's what they're doing here. This is showing how difficult it was to fight in these conditions using these tactics. They would hook these up to tanks too. They were like tank flamethrowers. They're pretty cool looking, actually.
Of the population dead. A total of around 100,000 Japanese, in addition to 12,000 American soldiers.
100,000. Everybody goes to their
They now
death here.
control the most valuable island of them all. The island that will enable them to invade the mainland.
Commit suicide.
But they're also left with a horrifying clarity of how serious Japan is about not surrendering, about fighting until the very end. Invading the mainland will be costly.
Okay.
Meanwhile, in Europe, Hitler and his allies have been defeated. The winners get together and issue a statement to Japan. Unconditional surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. Now that Hitler is defeated,
it's also important to note here that Stalin is making do on his promise. Now, he had promised, by the way, you're seeing Truman there. FDR just died a month ago here, who had done a lot of these negotiations with Stalin and Churchill, etc. But remember, there was a deal, and the reason why United States one of the reasons they're going to go boots on the ground in Europe here was they are going to want help against Japan from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union have been fighting the Japanese as well, but their focus by far has been Germany. And Stalin told, FDR said, hey, we're not really going to help you with Japan unless you help us with the Nazis. So there you go. D-Day happens. Stalin said, do D-Day or we're not going to really be able to help you, okay, with Japan. Americans make do on this, and there you go. Now, part of that agreement was that the Soviet Union is going to need a little bit of time to recuperate and do all that stuff. They said 3 months. Okay, Stalin said 3 months. 3 months after the Germans are done with, we'll help you with Japan. Now, that is going to become very interesting because it is right at that 3-month mark that you're going to see the Americans use the atomic bomb, which was not available at the time these agreements were made. This is in May. Bomb does not get tested until July. Still a couple months out for that. But it also, coincides when Japan, the Russians here actually make do on their promise, begin their assault. They begin their invasion of Japanese-controlled territories around Manchuria, potentially for an invasion of Japan. And that's going to bring up a whole bunch of other different talking points about use of the atomic bombs. I'll see if Johnny gets to it. If not, I'll chime back in.
The Soviet Union is also preparing to join the U.S. to deal the final blow to Japan. But Japan doesn't reply to the demand for surrender, and the Allies see this as a rejection. Back in the U.S., in the deserts of the Southwest.
Eventually it's going to get to the point, though, where they're going to say, yeah, but we're not giving up the emperor. We'll give up everything else, but not the emperor. That actually does become a negotiating point at this point as well. It's important to understand
the U.S. has just successfully tested an atomic bomb.
It wasn't
so
they
now they have a
rejected
decision
everything.
to make. They either continue their momentum and invade the mainland of Japan and face not only Japanese soldiers, but civilian militias of potentially tens of millions of citizens ready to fight. And it would also involve the Soviet Union participating, which means if they won the war with the Soviets' help, they would have to split control and influence over Japan's empire after the war. Or, the second option was to use their new powerful bomb to swiftly end the war, with no more loss of American lives and much less Soviet influence in post-war Japan.
Such an important narrative that has to get talked about. It's amazing how discussion of the use of the atomic bombs ignores the Soviet side of things. It's often talked about in conversations where 100% of it is to stop a mainland invasion. Okay, that can be a part of it. There are more things at play here. There are absolutely more political things in play here. The United States does not trust Joseph Stalin. They don't like Joseph Stalin. They don't like the Soviet Union. This is totally an enemy of my enemy is my friend thing. They also saw that in those 3 months, okay, of time after the war, the Soviet Union was not vacating these places that they had taken over in Eastern Europe. And the brutality in those areas were incredible as well, of going into Eastern Europe there. They could see that that was not going to be a relationship that they are going to continue. It's not one, they do not trust them. He believes that there's broken promises by Stalin at this time. They do not want to have to compete with the Russians for some kind of future control of Japan. Japan could absolutely be seen as a post-war positive thing for the post-war world here, just like the Americans saw it with Germany and pumping money into the Marshall Plan and stuff like that. They also don't want to see Japan fall to communism like they believe everything else is going to that gets touched by the Soviet Union here. They don't want those things. All of a sudden, it starts to become a little bit more sense why the atomic bombs are going to be used, when they did, how quickly they were used, because there is an element there. And you could put that percentage of what the total decision was between all the different factors that led up to the use of the atomic bombs. But you have to calculate at least something, and at least take into account of the Soviet side of things here. You got to.
Could do it on their own while also sending a message to the Soviets in post-war Japan. They could do it on their own while also sending a message to the Soviets
they controlled Japan
that they were the
themselves.
most powerful.
In all the terms.
On August 6, 1945, they chose the second plan. They dropped this unfathomably powerful bomb on the city of Hiroshima, releasing a hellfire the world had never seen and killing 140,000 people, almost all of them civilians, forever altering the course of history. 2 days later, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and began rapidly taking their territory.
So with this happening, this is why bomb number 2 is going to be very quick as well. Right now, the Americans are expecting and wanting a full unconditional surrender. Again, by this time, the Japanese are willing to give up basically everything except giving up the emperor, but still not seen as good enough.
Still doesn't surrender. The U.S. drops another bomb.
3 days later.
This one on the city of Nagasaki. The Soviets continue to rapidly take territory, and it's more clear than ever that it is over for Japan. While some factions of the Japanese army still don't want to surrender, the emperor goes around them and tells the nation that it's over.
This
Japan
is basically
unconditionally surrendering.
Emperor does understand at this point that the powers that be are not going to surrender on his behalf, not going to surrender him. Right? Hirohito is going to have to come out and do this, otherwise keeps going, and they don't want to have to deal with a land invasion. Plus, they'd be fighting the United States. Remember, they'd be fighting the Soviet Union too. Not something that you're going to want to deal with.
The Americans moved in, took away Japan's powerful military,
MacArthur
prosecuted the war criminals, and sent tens of thousands of troops to the vital island of Okinawa.
By the way, do you know that there's still not a Japanese military? Essentially, they have a small defensive force, but they're not allowed to do anything offensive. Very, very limited. That's still the case. Interestingly, the United States sees itself as right now the military protection of Japan, but yeah, they can't get involved offensively in matters. Say the United States wants Japan to come and help would have wanted to help them to come help in Iraq or something like that. Nope. Can't do that.
The U.S. stayed as the occupying power until the 1970s, and where they still have tens of thousands of troops that serve American interests in Asia, while also being Japan's main source of security. The memory of this war is still in the minds of the people here, especially for those in the cities that were bombed and the southern islands that were invaded. And as this region becomes tense again, Japan is now expanding its military once again, mostly down here on these vital islands. I traveled here.
Yeah, a lot of that is because of now the competition with China. With China, that's been kind of a bigger one, potentially with North Korea as well. But yes, and the Americans, as you notice here, are still they're kind of letting it happen. They're not in any way. The Japanese aren't in any way able to have anything offensive with that. And I don't think anyone's even really thinking about Japan trying to resurrect their early 20th century empire. Are we, now that we're a couple generations beyond that, is that a thing now where the Japanese should be able to have full control over their military decisions now? We're in that interesting kind of in-between period right now.
To see what that looks like and to talk to the people about what this feels like, what they're worried about.
So you can do another
and
video?
I'll be sharing that story in an upcoming video.
Oh, cool.
Pray that peace
That will be interesting.
be now restored to the world,
Let's listen to MacArthur.
and that God will preserve it always.
All right. Final thoughts. All right. So at the beginning of the video, I was wondering if Johnny was going to have, I don't know, maybe some kind of hot take or something like that. This was definitely more of just an explainer thing. And as it was up until this last couple minutes, I felt like this is kind of a waste of time for him, because he does, a lot of geopolitics and a lot of, good stuff with that. But this story about why Japan is lost, how World War II ended, what the War of the Pacific was like, is completely been covered. And if you're not going to add anything new, a new slant, it doesn't really add much. But now it makes sense, because it looks like he's using this as the background video for a video he's going to be putting out with these interviews with people in the Japanese military. That I think could be really fascinating, because I'll be honest, I'm very ignorant to what a lot of those opinions are from like the individuals about their relationship with their military, their relationship with the United States when it comes to that interaction with their military. So I think that could actually be really interesting to check out. It makes sense maybe why he did this video. All right, well, hopefully I was able to add context. There was a lot of things that he did not put in that I think were important. I do think that did need to get talked about. If you are an avid World War II person, you probably got nothing new out of this, but fun to be able to look at this. And again, I'll be looking forward to the follow-up to this with those interviews. Special thank you to the people that are supporting on Patreon. And then, of course, the people over at YouTube and the YouTube channel memberships. YouTube channel members, you got early access to this video. Anyway, thank you to all of you that have been pledging with that, and we'll see y'all next time.